You probably just created an amazing acrylic painting, and while researching how to protect that painting, you came across the term isolation coat, and you want to know what it is and whether you need to use it for your acrylic pour. So in this video, I'm going to explain what an isolation coat is, why you may or may not want to use an isolation coat, do a practical demonstration of why an isolation coat can be helpful, and also let you know what I do with my acrylic paint pourer similar to this one that you see here. So first, what is an isolation coat? In the easiest of terms, it's a barrier between your acrylic paint, isolation coat or barrier coat, and your varnish. So it isolates your paint from your varnish. Now, the next question is probably, why would I want to isolate or protect my paint from my varnish? That doesn't make sense. Isn't varnish supposed to go on your painting to protect it? Yes. However, if I want to remove that varnish sometime down the road, something major happens. You know, at my house, we had a major fire in our house and we had a bunch of paintings in the house. So those paintings got soot on them that wouldn't just wash off. So we had to remove the varnish from those paintings and re-varnish them. So the thing is, to remove a varnish, you have to use a solvent, something that will dissolve that varnish. So we put a layer in between to protect our painting from the dissolver or the solvent for the varnish that's on top. Now, not all varnishes can be removed. There are some varnishes that are permanent, like the gloss varnish from Liquitex, and there are some that are removable, like Gamvar is. So an isolation coat would get used when I put a varnish on that I could potentially remove with a solvent later on. So that's the reason why you would use an isolation coat. So those of you that have watched my videos before, you know I like to get my hands dirty with what I'm learning. And so what I've done is I've taken one of my old paintings that I didn't really like, that had a lot of cracks and things, and we're going to do a practical application here. So what I've actually done is I've broken this into 9 different areas on my painting, and I've painted each one of those differently so we can do some tests. So here's what we did. First of all, this painting was an acrylic pour using Floetrol. And so it has kind of a matte finish. You can kind of see that in the middle there, the matte finish. And what I've done is I've used 2 different kinds of isolation coats and then no isolation coat. And I've used 2 different kinds of varnish on top of those isolation coats and then no varnish. And the reason being is now I can test each one of these against each other and see them all together. So essentially what I did is I used my frog tape to section off my 3 things, and I used the golden isolation coat. I believe it was 2 layers to get a nice uniform sheen across this whole area. I did the same thing with gloss gel medium, although I diluted this 2 parts gloss gel medium, 1 part water to make it a little bit more liquid. And that is just another way that people have done that without actually buying a specific isolation coat, because both of these are actually quite expensive, at least according to my budget. So each one of those I got a nice sheen, and then I let that dry. And then I did, on this section, I did the exact same thing. This top section is my normal way, where I have gloss varnish from Liquitex. I actually water it, 50% gloss varnish, 50% water, and I rub it on in multiple coats. I have a video about that, which I will link in the description above. And then I use the Gamvar Satin, which is a removable, this one is permanent, this one's a removable varnish, and I use that down here. So as you can see, I now have 9 different areas with different sheens, just because of the different, how I added it. And we can do tests on each one of those to see how using different solvents or different abuse to those paintings can affect them. So just to show really quickly, I have, this is going to be gel medium isolation coat and my rub-on Liquitex gloss varnish, permanent varnish. No varnish, but gel isolation coat. gel isolation coat, but with the Gamvar varnish. This does not have any isolation coat, so you can see how shiny the Gamvar is across all of these. Actually, it's the same across all. So just Gamvar, nothing. This is just my paint pour, and then this is just my Liquitex gloss varnish, the permanent. Here I have isolation coat from Golden, and then the gloss varnish, permanent gloss varnish from Liquitex. The Golden isolation coat with nothing, and you can see it's a nice gloss varnish also. And then the gloss isolation coat plus the Gamvar varnish. So just regardless of what I did, the Gamvar varnish is the same all around. The gel, see how the gel is nice and glossy here, but then less glossy here? The reason being is it has, essentially I have multiple layers of gloss gel and then multiple layers of gloss varnish. The more varnish you put on, the more gloss varnish you put on, the glossier it gets. So it's kind of an additive property. So this one has less gloss. And same thing with this one, it's really glossy. So if you're using a isolation coat, the isolation coat is generally going to be glossy. Almost all of them are glossy, just so you get a nice flat finish to put your varnish on. So you got to keep in mind that whatever varnish you put on top is going to be even more glossy. So if you want almost no, you'd want to use matte. If you want a little bit of gloss, you'd satin. Medium gloss, and lots of gloss, you'd use a very glossy, I can't remember what they call it, on top. So just one thing to think about. So the two tests I want to use here is I want to try and remove each of these different layers with low mineral spirits. And then I want to try to remove it with isopropyl alcohol. And then we'll just leave a section where I don't remove anything to kind of get an idea of how it looks with each one's using these two different solvents. So first I'm going to open my window here. And I'm going to put on a mask for both of these. I'm sorry if my voice sounds funny, but I'm not doing this without proper protective gear. Hopefully you can still hear me pretty good. Okay, so first we're going to go with the low odor mineral spirits. Now yes, you can buy the Gamblin version of this. I already had this, so I didn't think there was any reason for me to get their brand over my household brand. So I'm going to put this on. And first I'm going to start with the gel medium and the permanent varnish. Now there is a proper way to do this. Generally you'd wet this down, you'd put it on, you'd let it sit. I'm not doing that because it'll take forever here and I don't want to have to take that, so we're just going to put it on and rub it in. And this varnish actually doesn't do anything, well, it does very little to a permanent acrylic varnish. So I didn't expect it actually to do anything there. So now let me get another paper towel. And we'll do the same thing for the only gloss gel. And again, there's no color here, it's not really doing anything. And last but not least, we're using it on the removable varnish. So I am going to let it sit for just a second. So now I've used the mineral spirits on the right side of all of these sections. And I just have a soapy paper towel. I'm just going to kind of clean up all of that off of. So if you notice, no paint really came off, so I never got down to the paint. No paint came off. So essentially what I've done here hasn't removed any paint yet. But an interesting thing is you can actually see by the sheen that I removed. This is the Gamvar This is after I use these mineral spirits, and look, this looks exactly the same as the only the gloss medium and no Gambar. So it removed it just fine, removed it here just fine. I have the same sheen, which is almost no sheen. And if you move over, you can see the sheen on this. This is just regular, nothing's on this one. Same thing here, the sheen is exactly the same as just the isolation coat. And then I remove the Gambar. You can see I didn't quite rub this one near as much because it didn't all get off, but most of it did come off, and I still have the Gambar sheen here. So this again is the removable, and you can see that it definitely is removable based on what we're seeing here. So now let's try with the isopropyl alcohol. Now before we do the isopropyl alcohol, just notice I have these on my table, so they got a little bit of the paint from the table, but there's no color on any of these. No paint came up with this mineral thinner from my section here, which is exactly what we'd expect because we have the isolation coat, which is a permanent and doesn't get dissolved by the mineral spirits. So now let's do the same thing with the alcohol. Now one thing to note, this is much more aggressive than the mineral spirits, and it will ultimately remove acrylic paint if enough is put on. So I'm going to I don't want it to be too much, so I'm going to kind of go on this side. It went through everything. So next we're going to go through the just painting. Again, it's through everything already. I'm going to fold this up, use a new side, and then again, I'm starting to get paint, so it's going through everything. So it took a while. It took a lot longer to get down to the color, but it did. So I'm using this section now. And this is just the golden isolation coat. Again, I got back to it. Go to this side. Oh man, I can already feel it. And we start to get color. Okay, so now that I cleaned that off, I was just looking at where I cleaned with the alcohol here, where I cleaned with the alcohol here. Here's my line, here's where I cleaned with the alcohol. And where I cleaned with the alcohol here, I didn't see anything here. So I went back and thought, wait a minute, did I do that the same way? And come to find out, when I was using the low mineral spirits, I actually used it over the side a little bit on this. So even though my paper towel, you can see my line here, my paper towel was about this big when I was doing it and rubbing it. But if you notice, it only took varnish off from that one side because I think I was over the top with my mineral spirits. Because here, the isopropyl alcohol didn't take off any of this. And I think this one had a little bit of color because I went up over just a tiny bit. You can see how this is more removed than this here, just based on the sheen. So I think the alcohol didn't, or very little dissolved the Gambar set. And the only reason I got color on these two was because the previous test I had kind of overlapped on the line with the mineral spirits, and that had kind of removed it. And so I was going not alcohol to Gambar, I was going alcohol to acrylic straight. And the alcohol quickly dissolves the acrylic, but does not quickly dissolve the Gamvar. But again, still we can see it dissolved here, and I pulled up color. It dissolved here. You can kind of see the different sheen from right here to right here, and pulled up color. And it's really obvious here. See, the sheen is all flat here, and here it's, so it pulled up the color there. So alcohol definitely breaks down the acrylic paint. Mineral spirits definitely breaks down the Gamvar, but doesn't break down the acrylic varnish. And that's just a practical application of how a isolation coat works to remove the allow you to remove varnish, but not to remove the layer in between, or the isolation coat. And because I have the isolation coat, I don't damage the acrylic paint underneath. So now that you've seen some practical examples of isolation coats, varnishes, and lack thereof, the question now is, do you need an isolation coat on your acrylic paint pours? And the answer to that is actually no. You don't need it. However, there are circumstances where people might want to use them. I know artists that don't use any varnish for their acrylic pours. Some that use permanent varnishes, like the Liquitex gloss varnish that I mentioned before. I'm one of those. Generally, I varnish all of my paintings with a permanent varnish. And then there's another that use an isolation coat because they want their painting to last a very long time, or they know their painting is going to take some duress and they want to be able to remove and add varnish again and again. So it really depends on your needs. And so I want to compare and contrast those three things. So one of the things that people worry about is the sheen on their paintings. With my acrylic paint pours, depending on what paints I use, sometimes I get different sheens out of my paints. Sometimes I get kind of a matte sheen for my background. I get some glossy sheen with the metallics. I get some kind of satin sheen with some of the other paints that I use. And that sheen on my painting looks really cool. And I want to keep that. If I add an isolation coat or I add a permanent varnish, that's going to make the sheen of my painting uniform, the same everywhere, and I will lose that. And so that may be one case where you don't want to use a varnish. The second case is ease of use. Obviously, not doing anything is way easier than adding a permanent varnish, which is way easier than adding a permanent varnish on top of an isolation coat. Then there's the strength. Acrylic paint is pretty strong, but it is not very strong, just pretty strong. If I add a permanent varnish, I get a very hard layer, a nice varnish layer on top that gives me some protection between my the natural air and my acrylic paint. An isolation coat essentially doubles that. You get the hard, nice isolation coat, and then you get a varnish on top of that. The second thing is, if I want my painting to all look the same, again the sheen, I could do a permanent varnish, because that's going to go on and then it'll kind of give a more uniform sheen across everything. And then obviously an isolation coat, which is generally gloss, just because it makes a nice flat surface. And then a varnish, doesn't matter what sheen it is, matte, satin, gloss on top of that, that will all be uniform. Another thing is, if I don't like some of the pits and valleys in my painting, or I want to make sure that no dust or things like that can get in the little pores that acrylic paint has, I might want to do a varnish, or I might want to do an isolation coat and a varnish, because it will fill all those gaps in. And when I wash my painting, I'm washing a nice flat surface rather than a surface that has places where dust and dirt and grime can get connected to. That's just a couple of things to think about when you're deciding whether you're going to varnish and or isolation coat and varnish your painting. Now for me, I generally just put a permanent varnish on my paintings. Those paintings are going to last multiple people's lifetimes. If I give one to my child, it's going to last his lifetime, and then potentially their child, their lifetime, as long as it's not, put in front of a window all day, every day. The varnish has a great UV protection. It's going to last a long time. Will it last 200, 300, 500 years? Probably not. but that's not what I'm going for with my painting, so I don't worry about that. A varnish, I like that I can clean more vigorously my paintings after the fact with the varnish, so that's another thing. Again, it gives it that strong, a little bit stronger surface. So if I do drop the painting, if somebody actually runs in the painting in my house, it has a little bit more strength there. And in the end, it's easier on my budget and it's easier on my time. It takes less time and it costs less. So that's why I generally just put a permanent varnish on my paintings, and you can see how I do that in this video here.